All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I almost said good morning there. I hope everyone settled in, right? I see some familiar names and faces, of course. Glad everyone had the time to join in for today, right? So let me introduce myself first. I'm Agnes Silva. I'm a faculty here at the Department of International Studies here at FEU. So welcome to our first departmental webinar series. We've got an exciting topic here today. I see a lot of third year and fourth year students mostly, right? Hopefully you'll use whatever knowledge and whatever insights, right, you'll get from this webinar, right? So what a great way to kick off our webinar series, right? So before we formally begin, let me just remind everyone on the few guidelines, right, for all the participants. Okay, always be on time, dress appropriately. A webinar is a formal engagement in an online setting. Check your Wi-Fi connection before joining the webinar or online training. Use appropriate equipment for the webinar. When using a mobile phone, use a headset to reduce the noise that they might pick up in your location. Avoid using the speakerphone. Put your phone on silent or on airplane mode. Avoid taking a call while the webinar is ongoing. Use the mute button to prevent the unnecessary noise that will disrupt the program. Release the unmute button when it's time for you to speak or during the Q&A forum later on. When asking a question, state your name, your affiliation first before throwing in your question. Also, speak with clarity. Be courteous and do not engage in chat with others while the webinar is ongoing. The organizers reserve its right to disengage anyone from the webinar who will not follow the guidelines. Lastly, I'd like to add this webinar will be recorded. So with you being here, you're giving your consent to be recorded, right? Right.
Recording in progress.
Okay, so the recording has begun. And let's begin first with the Philippine National Anthem.
Bayang magiliw, para sa silanganan, alam ng puso, sa dilim mo'y buhay. Lupang hinirang, gulit ka ng magiting, sa manlulupi, di ka pasisipin, sa dagat at puno'y sa simoy, sa labing kong bulo, may binatang tuna at awit sa paglayang minamahal, ang isa't ng watawat mo'y tagumpay na nagbihinig. Ang bituin ng araw niyang kailan, pag may di mag-iinig, lupa ng araw ng war, ating pagsinta, mo'y langit sa piling mo. Aming ligaya ng pagkay mga api, ang mamatay ng dahil sa'yo.
May I call on Ms. Marian Gongora, the Faculty of Department of International Studies, for the opening remarks.
Okay, in line with the Far Eastern University's mission to promote sustainable and responsive research towards national and global development, the Department of International Studies has always made research with foremost emphasis. Through our curriculum here in IS, as well as our programs and events such as this, the significance of research as a skill that students will be able to carry with them when they graduate is highlighted. Although finding references on research that is tailor-made for international study students is challenging, Sage Publications fortunately has a book by our guest speaker that is still one of the main references we ask IS students to read until now. Some students even found the book helpful as they reach research professionally after graduation. However, together with the ongoing pandemic, health risks and quarantine restrictions have posed challenges in research, particularly in data gathering. Some of the questions that arise are, how could we research on international studies topics nowadays? Should we allow this situation to limit the topics we can pursue or the way we do our research? And how can we pursue our question-based researches that we will be able to add to the body of knowledge with everything that's going on? So this afternoon, as we convene here for a webinar, I am confident that our guest speaker will be able to enlighten us with regards to the topic at hand. And with this, I would like to welcome everyone to this webinar, especially our IS students, faculty members, students from other departments, and researchers who would like to learn more about recent developments in research.
Right. Thank you, Marianne, for your opening remarks. Now may I call on Mr. Jules Arceo to introduce now our speaker.
Good afternoon, everyone. Our speaker this afternoon is currently the Assistant Dean of the Institute for International Strategy at Tokyo International University in Japan, where he also holds the rank of Associate Professor for International Relations. Prior to teaching at Tokyo International University, he was an Assistant Professor of International Relations at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. He was also a lecturer of the Department of Politics at the University of Glasgow and University of Stirling in the United Kingdom. He received his PhD in politics from the University of Glasgow and a master's degree in international and European politics from the University of Edinburgh. He has also published several peer-reviewed articles and edited volumes on human rights, transnational justice, and peace building. He has likewise authored various books on research methods in international relations, the most recent of which was just published last year. To share his insights on current trends in international studies research, let us all welcome our speaker this afternoon, Associate Professor Christopher Lamont.
Yes, thank you so much for that kind introduction. And thank you, Agnes and Marian and Jules, and also the Department of International Studies at Far Eastern University for having me today. I'm really delighted to be here to talk to you about some of the current trends in international studies research, and also more broadly about research methodologies. And I thought it was really good that we started with questions about how the pandemic would impact our research, and especially when you think about kind of a subject like international studies that might be fieldwork intensive, you have seen significant disruption to research agendas and the such as a result of it. But before I get there, I guess I will kind of share a PowerPoint. Okay, so I'll do this. Great. So I've got a PowerPoint that I will begin with. And here what I'll do is I will go through the process of setting out kind of why we're talking about research methodologies, how research methods are something that's a little bit distinct, but most importantly, why this matters. And I teach a lot of research methods courses. I've taught a lot of research methods courses in a lot of different places. So as was mentioned by Jules, and most recently before coming to Tokyo at the University of Groningen for about 7 years. And one of the challenges is that as students of international studies or of international relations, often you don't sign up for a research methods or methodology class because you have a very strong interest in methodology debates or research methods. That your interests are usually related to some topic or some aspect of international affairs or international studies that that motivated you to study this major in the first place. And sometimes these debates can seem a little abstract or remote or hard to engage with. I'll say, as I deal with in both kind of the introduction to the first edition of the research methods book that was mentioned, and also in the second edition of this research methods book, which is coming out very soon at the end of this year, it's actually something. The question of methods, methodologies is something that every one of you are thinking about, and each one of you have and make in your daily lives certain assumptions that are related to methodology. So one kind of practical problem that you might think about in general when thinking about research and international studies is that you have access to all this information now at your fingertips, right? We talk about even during the pandemic. Digital research is something that more and more students are able to take advantage of. There's all sorts of different types of information, from social media to blogs to discussion forums and online news, and you're confronted with making sense of this. In addition to that, we know that there's also a different type of information that you have access to, and that's scholarly research. And whether in the humanities or the social sciences or even kind of in the other sciences, we know that scholarly research is a specific kind of knowledge. And if we see research broadly as simply the search for knowledge, then what makes scholarly research different from any other forms of writing? Now, one thing that we'll talk about in today's lecture is that on the one hand, you have those who suggest that kind of loosening the boundaries in relation to methodology and methods kind of opens up the door to anything goes in terms of research in international studies. And on the other side, you have those who argue that kind of too narrow of a definition of what constitutes scholarly research then excludes a whole lot of knowledge and a whole lot of debates from the field. And so rather than kind of trying to narrow the scope of the field, what is presented here is an approach that would have you just kind of, that emphasizes openness and transparency in the research process and about the choices that you make. And if you make that your starting point, then justifying your methods and methodology becomes kind of much easier and also much less abstract. So where to begin, right? This is something that as students, a lot of you have probably considered. And you might hear about kind of puzzles as a source of research or kind of explanations. And here's one good kind of broader way to think about it from Barbara Geddes, who writes that contrary to the advice about looking for holes in the literature, good research often begins with either an intense or unfocused curiosity about why some event or process has happened, or with a sense of sputtering indignation at the patent idiocy of some particular argument advanced in the literature. Sometimes political commitments or an aroused sense of injustice drive this curiosity or indignation. And this is important, is that when thinking about your own research and thinking about methodological debates that I'm going to present to you, there's something about your research topic or question that you find particularly interesting, and understanding where that fits in here will help you articulate kind of a more concise and clear research question. So what is methodology then? Well, let's break it down to its most basic sense. And in that kind of meaning, methodology simply refers to how we make sense of the world around us or how we acquire knowledge. It's closely related to something that I hinted at just now, and that's epistemology, which are evaluatory standards for what we value as knowledge. You might think about this as like the feedback you might get on an essay, like what did you do right, what did you do wrong, what are you missing? And you also could think about this in the context of maybe kind of classes where you're presented with the kind of the scientific method, which for the natural sciences presents a template of what a research process should look like. And of course, as students of international studies, we have an interest in ontology, and this is simply understanding the objects of our study. We are confronted with a number of complex social organizations that we study and we make assumptions about, whether that be the state or international law, international rules. And sometimes our interests are more constitutive in a sense of kind of where did these come from? Or what do we mean when we say the state? Or what are we talking about when we're talking about compliance with international rules? Now, many of you are probably familiar with this type of dichotomy that kind of breaks down two major approaches that you will see in the literature. And on the one hand, you have kind of positivist or kind of empirical work. And on the other, you have kind of interpretive. And if you think about this from kind of your perspective, one would have you see or understand the world and your role as a researcher as one in which you're studying and seeking to uncover law-like regularities through the testing of conjectured relationships among variables. Right? That sounds really complex, but it could be something as simple as why did populist parties experience success in European elections after 2015, 2020, or something like that. And here, you'll know you're dealing with work that's operating within this tradition because you will be engaged in hypothesis testing. Meaning that, let's say, if you're thinking about populist parties, you might propose several explanations or a few explanations for why you think they might have enjoyed electoral success. And it's important that those explanations are falsifiable, right? That you can demonstrate, you can through process tracing find evidence that either kind of confirms or goes against the hypothesis. Now, a lot of students also write more interpretive work or engage with more interpretive work. And in here, you're assuming that your research in the world studied cannot be separated as the researcher is part of this social world. Right, you probably get this a lot in introduction to kind of methodology classes in terms of just basically thinking about how we situate ourselves in this world that we are studying. Unlike other fields where you are studying something that is not aware of your research, right, cannot respond to your research, we are part of this world. And therefore, we bring who we are to our research. And the other aspect is that kind of interstate relations, rather than being lendable to explanation through law-like regularities, that these are not static, but they're changing and dynamic as they're constituted by normative beliefs. And so rather than hypothesis testing here, you'll notice you'll encounter research that does things like the genealogical mapping of ideas, concepts, and practices, the study of discourses and meaning, and also research that seeks to explain how certain practices became possible. You might think about this, for example, we have this world of states, you have borders. How did this practice of keeping people from moving emerge? Like what are the ideas, the values, the discourses that sustains that particular practice? So if we move on a little bit, we see that in relation to how we study international studies, that positivism assumes that kind of you have a specification of fixed, given, and unchanging variables, which can be generalized for law-like causal inferences, and you will discover empirical regularities, that there's a world out there to be discovered, right? And we are kind of the scientists doing the discovering. And for interpretive researchers, you approach the world a bit differently, or what you are studying a bit differently in the sense that you're focusing on kind of the objects of study as social artifacts that are subject to change, and therefore their context and their time dependent. Now, this might sound complex, but let's think about how this plays out in kind of, if you think about a topic like inequality, for example, in international affairs, which is one that we've been thinking about for a very long time, particularly in kind of global justice debates. And if you think about inequality as kind of from one perspective, you might see it as just a condition that exists that requires explaining, and then kind of policy proposals to help mitigate that inequality. But on the other hand, you might see inequality as something that's kind of context and time, temporally dependent, that is a product of particular practices and historical processes that include kind of early 20th century colonialism and imperialism, which saw kind of the transfer of wealth from one part of the world to another. And then, so therefore, how you approach, right, this kind of question, this in 2021 of inequality would be different. And here, what you're aiming to do is to add to or kind of challenge existing understandings. But I want you to think about this kind of not necessarily, it's easy to present things and explain things as dichotomies, but when you kind of scratch the surface of anything, it becomes a lot more complex and nuanced. So you might think of this as kind of like almost a continuum, right, of approaches. And so on the one hand, you have kind of positivist work where researchers are independent and detached from the social world. And then on the other kind of hand, you have interpretive research. But this is just a snapshot, kind of a big kind of methodological and epistemological standards of kind of how we value and go about the making of knowledge. I'll present two more in addition to that. But I want to take a step back because this is also closely related to how we understand the project of theorizing and theories. And you'll notice that in a lot of your classes, you are encountered with theories, but sometimes these theoretical debates don't seem to talk to each other. And that's because you have different understandings of what theory is and what theory is supposed to do, depending on kind of what perspective you're operating within. And so for positivists, theories are general statements that describe and explain the causes of and effects of classes of phenomena. They like answering kind of big questions. And they're composed of causal laws or hypotheses, explanations, antecedent conditions. And the important thing here is that it should be like kind of aerodiagrammable in terms of process, right? So like kind of expansionism is a phenomenon that would result in territorial disputes, kind of which results in military force, which results in war. And you should have wide explanatory power or importance or a broad explanatory range. And so if you think about kind of theories like neorealism, there's a reason why they're so parsimonious, right? They don't actually contain that much. And they also require a very high degree of abstraction, right? Like you have to take this as a starting point that all states essentially are the same and they pursue the same thing. Now, there are different kinds of laws, and kind of one is deterministic, kind of if A, then you always get B, and the other is probabilistic, if A, and sometimes kind of with a probability of X, you get B, right? And that's where we live in the social sciences. And a hypothesis is simply a conjectured relationship between the two phenomena, and the explanation is the causal law or hypothesis that connect the cause, the phenomenon being cause, showing the causation. In your own research, you can approach explanation two ways. It can be specific or general. Like a specific explanation is an explanation that uses specific terms that accounts for a distinct event. Meaning, for example, you could say Japan's peace constitution placed limits on Japan's use of military force. Japan had an emphasis on kind of diplomacy and no war after the Second World War. A general explanation would be like constitutional renouncements of the use of force place limits on a state's ability to use military force and leads to a state's place an emphasis on diplomacy and not war. So when it comes to research design, you've got two large projects, theory building If we look at identify outlier cases, use comparative method for case study design, or even kind of extreme cases, or you can engage in theory testing through kind of mainly observation here within the social sciences. Now that kind of is a capsule summary of positivism going through kind of core terms onto research design. And we mentioned that, on the other hand, interpretive research starts off by questioning the proposition that the social world can be understood and explained through generalizable law-like statements. And those empirical regularities that we observe reflect social phenomena, not unobservable social forces that are law-like, right? So rather than seeing kind of these unobservable law-like properties as explaining broad ranges of event, we're approaching this as social phenomena that have very real, kind of identifiable, tangible social causes. And you see this kind of term, kind of these webs of meaning and kind of engagement with kind of the work of kind of Geertz and other kind of ethnographers who sought to explain the social meaning of particular practices. And we're applying that here to international affairs. One big set of questions that falls under this rubric is kind of asking the how or the how possible questions, right? So how do notions, for example, of Japanese identity shape Japan's kind of naturalization and citizenship policies, as an example? Now, within kind of this rubric, you also probably have encountered normative work and critical theory work. And I just briefly want to say something about these, because often one of the challenges you have is in terms of research design is that when you're confronted with a question, if you misapply or you start using kind of positivist standards for research design, it's going to become very, very, very messy. And also when you're assessing work, when you're reading scholarly literature as part of your own research, it's good to be able to understand what assumptions are being made by the author and what kind of work this is. And so normative theory explores and evaluates kind of ethical standards for behavior in international relations. And it has a long genealogy that stretches back to inquiries as to when the use of force could be justly used by rulers, right? So you might think about Walzer and the just war tradition, or you might think about debates on ethics, international ethics today as falling within this standards. And here you'd be looking for kind of those social artifacts that would signify those, that would help you identify those kind of rules and standards of behavior. And so your analytical logic that you would apply would be focused on the assessment of ethical standards. So for example, you might ask, under what conditions is the use of force justified? Or kind of another large research agenda that's out there is it ethical for states to engage in practices like targeted killings? Or you might think about normative theory from the perspective of the specification of rights and duties. Like, do states have a responsibility to protect the citizens of other states from their own governments? Or questions like, are human rights universal? Now, critical theory, on the other hand, sees the purpose of social scientific research to be that of kind of emancipation or liberation of humans from social processes of domination and oppression, which is slightly different. And their traditions, the main tradition that is engaged with here would be kind of the Frankfurt School and Horkheimer, but also you might look to kind of the work of Michel Foucault. And here you have also distinct analytical logics, such as, for example, how do discourses create and reproduce inequalities among groups? So you might think about, how do discourses of terrorism legitimize practices such as targeted killing, kind of while delegitimizing acts of non-state violence? And you might also think about how power and interests operate to marginalize groups. How do global trade frameworks protect the interests of the industrialized North, for example, while marginalizing potentially the global South? So here, this is kind of research with a purpose. In the context of international relations, you might think of kind of Cox's dichotomy kind of between kind of more emancipatory theory and problem-solving theory, that a lot of IR theory falls within the realm of problem solving. So one thing that you'll notice by this point is that there's a lot of pluralism out there. There are a lot of different ways to do research in international studies and international relations. And in order to make that work, people like Thaddeus Jackson have argued that it's important to evaluate research by the standards set for itself within its own methodological tradition. So don't apply positivist standards to interpretive projects, for example. And you evaluate projects on the basis of the internal logical coherence of the project. Oops. And this gets us kind of into another part of today's lecture, and that's the research process. So kind of what does this mean? How do you go about the application of these methodologies? How do they translate into things like kind of research questions and also your own work? Now, one of the most challenging tasks you'll face is moving from a research topic to crafting your own research question. And thinking about the overall logic of the project, your methodology will help you formulate your question in a way that is answerable in the course of your project. Now, a good research question is a necessary part of every paper that you'll write. You might think about this like, right, every paper needs a thesis, right? You need a point. Just like any conversation or any lecture that you might get for that matter, right? If you don't understand very quickly kind of what the point is or what the question that's being asked is, the reader will quickly grow disinterested. And so there's several things that you might want to think about in terms of what makes for a good research question. Now, of course, the shorter the better, but kind of within limitations in a sense that it should be short and grammatically simple. Too many clauses will make the question potentially confusing in terms of what is it you're being asked, and also how you go about answering the question and the feasibility of the project. Think about the precision in your question, right? It should be precise. It's perfectly fine to do country case studies, right? But say it, right? Don't reference kind of states in general if you're not intending to carry out research in which you're going to explore kind of the behavior of states in general. And also keep in mind it should be open-ended, meaning that it's not a yes/no question, right? It's not a in what year did something happen question. And it's researchable. And what this means is it just simply relates to the kind of the phenomena that we can engage with. You're not asking a type of question that might have, for example, a theological answer. Theoretically interesting simply means that you're engaging with theories and theoretical debates. You're taking usually a position within them, that you should be able to know what your research goal is. It applies the research approach, which gets back to kind of what I presented to you before, right? You should be able to say, okay, this is kind of a positivist explanatory kind of research question, or this is an interpretive question that's going to rely on discourse analysis, or this is a critical theory or normative theory question, and it shouldn't be speculative. And once you have that settled, then we get to the question of methods. Now, it's important to point out that kind of methods should not be viewed as like a practical guide to the truth in a sense, right? But rather, research methods are data collection and data analysis tools that allow you to make transparent the choices you make in the research process. And you need to be able to justify these research choices during the course of your own research. Right, so I've said that a couple times, and I think that's one thing that if you take away from this kind of presentation, is probably one of the more important things, and that's kind of that's the transparency in making your research choices. That what I'm not presenting is kind of a hierarchy of methodologies in terms of truth, but rather different ways of knowing within international studies that offer different perspectives to and on different issues that you are interested in or likely interested in as students of international affairs. But you need to be able to specify, you need to be able to engage with this, and you need to also understand the underlying logic. And if you're able to do that, then you're less likely to kind of fall into various pitfalls. Now, one thing that you think about when you think about research methods, though, are those basic tools for collecting data and analyzing data. And this gets us to a little bit to Jules's question at the very beginning about how much the pandemic has impacted our ability to go out and gather data. And you're probably aware that there are two, as kind of more advanced students, right? That there are two big sets of methods, tools that are available to you as students, right? Keep in mind this is different from methodologies. That here we're looking at the tools, right? So you might think about what we talked about before as being kind of like a architectural blueprint for a house, and now I'm taking you to look at kind of different tools. So depending on what kind of house you have set out to build during the course of your own research, you would rely on a different kind of set of tools. And so that gets us to the methods. I just want to check on time. I'm aware we want to have a question and answer session. Is there a kind of ideal ballpark amount of time you want me to present for?
I believe we still have, we can be up to 4 p.m. for
Okay,
our
great,
platform.
excellent. So up to 4 p.m. So I'll continue with this then, because I was wondering if we didn't have too much time, then this might be kind of a little bit too in depth. But we do. It sounds like we have plenty of time. So
And sorry if I may add, sir, the last 20 minutes will be for Q&A, perhaps, if you have time.
oh, of course, yes, yes. I definitely have a lot of time for Q&A, and I definitely would like students, if they have questions about what I'm saying, to ask them. So I hope to save a good amount of time for that. All right, so research methods. Now these are getting into the tools. And the first big set of tools that you might encounter is that of kind of those quantitative tools. And in fact, if you're reading kind of political science journals or kind of big international relations journals, you'll probably come across a lot of work that relies on quantitative tools. Now, I'm not always, but in general, these rely on an underlying positivist logic. What does that mean, and why is that the case? Well, it's not necessarily something that you should find as surprising, right? Because if you're looking at constant conjunction as causality, then the more cases or instances you have, the stronger you believe your kind of hypothesis would be. And the more evidence you have of a potential causal law. So for example, think about a big question in international studies relating to war and peace. And you might think about kind of in the 1990s, which is kind of a long time ago, right? Theories like the democratic peace theory were in vogue, and those relied on large data sets, on the kind of coding of countries into kind of democracy versus non-democracy, and then seeing if you find instances of conflict between two of them. And for kind of researchers working in that field, you saw kind of that what was believed to be constant conjunction, right? That it seemed that no matter how many kind of like at times you looked at this or you looked at the data, that it was hard to find instances of democracies going to war with other democracies. And here you see a preference towards kind of a large number of samples over a small number of samples. That if you're looking at using these quantitative tools, having just a small population of cases is something that would make it very difficult to make the types of claims that you would be trying to make. Now, of course, some of you are probably thinking that, well, you know, already here, right, you might begin to think from kind of a more interpretive perspective. Okay, so wait a second. So can we really, and how do we code these countries as democracies versus non-democracies, right? Is it, if you think back to the early 20th century and you think about like the United Kingdom was a very class stratified country, and suffrage was limited, and arguably the kind of the German Empire at the very beginning of the 20th century, there was a large kind of Socialist Party presence in Parliament. Of course, it was also a monarchy, but were these countries really so different where you could code one as a democracy or one as a non-democracy? Is this kind of a case of, I don't know, coding people you like as right as democracy, or people that you find within your alliances or not? Right. So again, we're talking about kind of their kind of temporal and kind of historic contingency. But anyway, from this positivist perspective, right, you need to be able to get a lot of cases, and you're making a lot of assumptions, and you're doing a lot of abstraction. There are two types of statistics that you engage with in this work, and one is super common. One you probably see, well, one you definitely see like every day, and those are descriptive statistics. And this refers to techniques to describe and visualize numeric data. And the focus here is to tell us something about the sample, not the population. Like the sample is the actual kind of group that finds itself within the data where the data has been collected. Inferential statistics draws inferences about the population on the basis of your sample, right? So you can have correlation among variables and covariation, right? So if one changes, then the other changes in a certain direction alongside it. And this inferential statistics is where you see a lot of the work in the social sciences in terms of quantitative work that's being published and worked on. Descriptive statistics can show up in a lot of different places. In addition to that, you'll also encounter things like models, like formal models in the study of international studies. And a model is simply a simplified picture of reality. There are actually a whole lot of them, and you're probably familiar with a lot of modeling practices, but in its most basic form, you start from postulates through which other deductions are made. And as a model comes closer to reality, it increases in complexity, right? And you have relationship models, kind of, which includes relationships among entities, organizations, people, places, things, or events. And also you see strategic models, which models strategic interaction among entities. And here you're assuming that an outcome is contingent upon the choices of actors, or kind of an actor on another actor. And here, one of the most common tools would be, or kind of common strategic models would be game theory as one. Whereas your outcome, or what you'd call your payoff, is contingent on the decision of a choice. Now, qualitative methods, right? So here, this is interesting. We're making a little bit of a shift here. So I mentioned at the start of quantitative that the very nature of kind of coding processes and kind of a preference towards large N in terms of statistical analysis already has an inbuilt bias towards positivism. And that qualitative tools can be used for a whole lot of different projects and are used for a whole lot of different projects. And when you're starting with qualitative data, there's all sorts of social artifacts. And one thing that students sometimes think about is you approach this very narrowly and you think about social artifacts as being just kind of the spoken or the written word, like textual data, such as parliamentary debate records, public pronouncements, laws, or interview transcripts or focus group transcripts that you've gathered during the course of your own research. But there's a lot of interesting work that's out there that engages with non-textual data. So you might think about artworks or photographs, visual representations, or maps. So how do visual images communicate concepts, ideas, beliefs? What do those images tell us? And how do some images become iconic images? And maps also is something that you might want to think about. What is the process of mapping tell us? How do these visual representations of the world structure how we see and engage with the world? So there's quite a lot of qualitative work that engages with non-textual data sources. Also, I could mention there like things like monuments or physical spaces. You might think about like how does a particular monument make you feel and why? What does it communicate? There are a number of different data collection techniques. So you might think about kind of ethnographic participant observation. One thing that a lot of my students have used, it's been very, very popular, is interviews, particularly type of interview, like elite interviews. Focus groups is another one that researchers use. These can be, usually they're seen as more challenging because you need a certain kind of number, kind of probably around 6 to a dozen participants per focus groups and a number of potential focus groups as part of a research project and somebody to facilitate the discussion. But these can be very effective ways of eliciting from a group of people how they see or they interpret a particular set of questions or a particular issue that you might be working on. Another is document or archival research. And one of the things in the second edition that I was had a discussion about was the question of where does this fit? So some would argue that this is not necessarily kind of a tool of field work, for example. But you'll notice that even with archival or document-based research, that they're often gatekeepers to the archives. And a lot of times you might not easily be able to get access to the types of information you want to get access to. However, of course, this is less of an issue today because one of the things that is different than, I guess, 6 years ago is that there are a lot more digital archives. And these are things that sometimes students aren't aware have been digitized, but you can find all sorts of government records relating to kind of major foreign policy decisions or major foreign policy events in the 20th century available to you through some of these archives. And also things like visual methods. And there's a particular kind of way you go about selecting your visual artifact that you're looking at. And usually this is going to be some sort of iconic photograph. So for example, you might think of research by a researcher, Vladimir Petrovich, who wrote an article on one iconic photo that was taken during the war in Bosnia of a paramilitary soldier standing over the remains of civilians and looking at kind of what visual elements of that picture made it an iconic picture and what it was communicating and how it helped frame outsiders' understandings to the conflict. Now, with this kind of diverse range of tools, you know that qualitative methods can be used then in a diverse range of projects, and it can be applied to kind of more positivistic purposes of identifying a specific causal mechanism, or you can be focused more on the interpretation of meanings. So here are three kind of big sets of tools for qualitative analysis. So I kind of went through the collection and now I'm getting into the analysis of qualitative data. The first one is process tracing. And this is a very common tool for evaluating hypotheses within cases, right? So if there's kind of a conjectured relationship between two variables within a particular country case study. So did the process that you would assume needed to have taken place in order to explain a particular outcome actually take place? So how do you go about doing that or researching that? Well, first it's important that in process tracing that you tell the full story, meaning you start from the beginning and you find a suitable endpoint. Now, this is difficult, and this is difficult not just for like researchers of international studies, but those who are working in projects that are related to, you might think about like truth commissions, for example, is something that comes to mind as a nice analogy here from the real world. And so if you think about, for example, you want to explain a process that led to a civil war, for example, you might start from kind of a couple years or just a year prior to the conflict. Right, so if you think about the breakup of Yugoslavia, you might think about, okay, you might start when kind of Slobodan Milosevic came to power in 1987. But others might say, well, wait a second, then that puts like kind of Serbian nationalism in the driver's seat of the causal story, right? That if you go back a little bit to the uprisings and the cancellation of Kosovo's autonomy in 1980, right? You see a slightly different story, and then if you go back to like the 1976 Constitution, and then you could theoretically end up all the way back to like 1389, right? And you can reproduce this for a number of potential stories, right? Process stories that you're looking at in your own research. So sometimes students will be like, well, okay, how do I know where to begin, and how do I know where to end? Well, there are a couple constraints that you're looking at, and one thing is to look at the one event that it is that you are seeking to explain. So is it like the outcome of the 2020 elections in kind of the US, or the kind of outbreak of the conflict in 1991 in the former Yugoslavia? And you'll go back to a particular point that's not too far removed in time, that there's no other intervening big event, right? Not like another civil war or something along those lines. And as for your endpoint, it often is that whatever it is being explained, right? You always need to establish the temporal boundaries, meaning the time boundaries. So this will probably also be in the title of your paper, right? So looking at electoral politics in the country from 1996 to 2004, something along those lines. When you do that, right, you don't make it too big or open-ended. This will help you do this second thing, which is to minimize breaks in the story. And this will allow you to provide as best as possible of a continuous investigation or continuous explanation. And also you're going to be evaluating evidence, and there's all sorts of different kinds of evidence, which is the data, right, that you're gathering, right? That there's certain things that must exist to support a causal process story. And the evidence in this case is stronger the more particular it is to an explanation. And evidence that is inconsistent with other explanations can increase the weight of your supported process story, right? So if it discounts kind of alternative hypotheses that you are encountering. So for example, how do people do this in research? Well, if we look at, for example, Ilona Subotic's book, Hijack Justice, she argued that, stated a clear hypothesis, right, that states create transitional justice institutions to get rid of domestic political opponents. And then she tells us that process tracing is used to examine whether the intervening variables between a hypothesized cause and observed effect shift as predicted. In other words, I use process tracing to examine causal mechanism at work. And in evaluating the evidence and applying this method, I triangulate across multiple data pools, including in-person interviews, public opinion surveys, newspapers, and other media reports, primary archival sources, institutional documentation, government and NGO reports, and also secondary literature. So this is what, right, if we go back and you kind of connect the dots with kind of the qualitative data analysis, right, this is what you're gathering the data to do. And then here you are engaged in the analysis of that data. Now, we also mentioned content analysis and discourse analysis. Now, content analysis refers to the study of artifacts of social communication. And as I mentioned kind of earlier, but in a slightly different context, this can also kind of include texts, speeches, but also photographs, films, or other forms of art. And also here you have kind of a more quantitative variant, which allows you to include large amounts of data through coding, which in turn allows for the application of statistical tests, right? So if you're looking at, for example, a large amount of textual data, like kind of the coverage of terrorism within kind of national newspapers or something like that, you can begin to code for potentially different types of news stories on that particular event. Discourse analysis requires you to be kind of more specific in terms of identifying kind of that textual source that you are analyzing. And here it's important to find a source that is authoritative, meaning that you would look for example, if you're looking at foreign policy discourses in the US context, you might look at kind of a major policy speech by a US president, or a couple speeches or several speeches, or you might look at speeches by, for example, a UK prime minister or a German chancellor. And here what you're looking at is you're focusing on the interpretation of linguistic forms of communication. And because of that, your analysis won't necessarily allow you to go through kind of large amounts of text, but you won't necessarily need to do that, as your focus will be on particular, for example, speeches or official or unofficial statements. And then we go back and you think, okay, so kind of interpretation of meanings in different ways. Is this one that's kind of critical in a sense that you're looking at how discourses of a particular practice are framed in a way that disempowers or marginalizes certain groups of people? Or is it kind of more kind of constitutive and interpretive in the sense that you are looking at how certain ideas and practices emerged in international affairs, right? So thinking about kind of how particular practices such as, for example, borders are discussed, understood, or even like a concept as complex as sovereignty, right? How do different states understand this term, and how does it differ? So this is kind of a bigger picture now. We can zoom out a little bit and think about some of the advantages and limitations of these sets of tools. And the question of whether or not you want to use these tools is something that would require you to think about how you phrased your research question, right? If you phrase your research question in a way that requires you to look at large amounts of data, like you're looking at kind of a broad social practice across a number of countries, then these are the types of tools that you would need to use. Now, one thing that has made this easier for students more recently is there's actually today a lot of free and open access data analysis and data collection software packages that you can make use of. So doing things like, for example, regressions are actually not that difficult and doesn't require kind of much more than simply kind of access to the data itself and the ability to put this data into kind of these software packages, like for example, even Excel would be a kind of widely used example. So if you're thinking about strengths here for quantitative methods, one is the aggregation of large amounts of data to an extent that's not possible without quantification. And the second is the high degree of specificity as a result of explicit statements about assumptions and relationships, that when you put your argument into mathematical language, the meaning is fixed with from a quantitative perspective, a higher degree of specificity. And also you can make those like long causal arguments kind of much more concisely. They're explicit about processes which allow for a high degree of transparency. And also statistical methods can assist in understanding relationships between variables and observe constant conjunction, and allows for causal inference. And it's an easy means to test theory and hypotheses. Now, on the other hand, right, that qualitative tools allows for us to gather in-depth knowledge about our specific cases, whereas here you're treating the cases as just kind of on the other hand, from a quantitative perspective, the cases are just like another data point or something that needs to be coded. And from a positivist perspective, case study design can allow us to maximize causal inference from our specific studies. And process tracing also allows for the evaluation of causal stories. And also qualitative methods allows for the researcher to identify specific causal mechanisms that link two or more variables, right? On the one hand, you have Humean causality, which is based on conjunction, right? Covariation, that if you change one variable, it seems the other one always changes as well. But the process is still a black box, right? Even if it changes, it seems to occur with regularity. Here you're going back and you're looking specifically at like one particular case or process and identifying what is it that is causing that. And one of the challenges with gathering quantitative data in general is you'll notice that you can only gather data that you think exists out there already, right? So you're only testing those variables that for some reason you think might be part of a particular causal explanation. But in the course of qualitative work, right, you have an opportunity to come up with new theories, new hypotheses, and perhaps new ways of understanding a particular phenomenon. So for example, if you're if you're interested in researching things like international courts and you're thinking about why states cooperate you might come up with maybe 3 causes, and then you go through and you record all instances of compliance with an international court, and you test them, and you might come up with a particular explanation on the basis of that, but there might be something kind of totally different that's happening in one of the cases, right, that you might not know about, right? That a country might be complying for other reasons, or it might be complying with the court's decision and then telling its own population, we don't really think that's legitimate, right? Might be contesting it discursively in different ways. And so you wouldn't be able to know that without doing kind of in-depth case study research. Now, these are not mutually exclusive, right? So there's a lot of researchers who would use these tools in conjunction with each other. The one thing to keep in mind, though, is that underlying logic that I started from, kind of talk about kind of positivism and interpretivism, that needs to remain consistent throughout. So here's some additional considerations that go beyond kind of the question of methodology and also the questions of research design. And one is case study design, and case study design is closely related actually to methodology. So you need to ask yourself, what is it you want to do with the case study, right? If it's contingent and specific on kind of explaining something within a particular case or understanding a particular case, then if you say that at the outset, then that's fine. But if you do a case study and then you're trying to make some bigger kind of broader positivistic claim, or you're engaging with kind of positive theory as defined by Vanavera, then you're always going to get kind of back in the kind of feedback that, you didn't actually make the argument through this particular case. There's also ways where people choose their case studies by using statistical analysis up front, right? So there might be a outlier in your statistics, and you might kind of choose that as your case to, wait a second, so something different must be happening there, so I'm going to try to isolate that case for study. Or you might compare cases, right? You might compare cases on the basis of kind of similarities, like they're similar in many respects, but they differ in one kind of key variable that you are looking at. Or they might share that key variable, but differ in other respects, right? So they're different logics. And the next is field work, which is something that we can talk about maybe a little bit in the Q&A session here, as I want to kind of wrap up here in the next few minutes to give you time to talk a little bit more, and also kind of the question of, as I already mentioned, kind of mixed methods. And also another thing that students have a lot of questions about is writing up and publishing. I just want to say this is not a linear process in terms of writing. That often when you're writing your research, you'll be starting a lot of times really from the middle, right? In terms of like kind of writing about your data. And then the introduction is something that you'll go back and rewrite. Students that don't do this, it's really obvious, because it's almost like you're reading an introduction that doesn't fit. Like it's kind of turned into like a different essay as you've gone through the research process. Well, I've talked for quite a bit of time by this point, and I covered a whole lot. So I am happy at this point to answer questions either about what I've talked about, or if something, maybe you're curious about something that I haven't talked about. So either is fine. Thank you very much for listening. So, oops. Thank you. Thank you very much. Also, I put my email address up there, so feel free to get in touch with me as well if there are specific questions that I wasn't able to answer.
Thank you so much, Associate Professor Lamont. Yeah, I believe that this is very timely topic, right? And I'm really glad that this is our first webinar, because it sets the tone, especially for our students, right? And of course, our faculty, how to do better, how to better analyze or process our knowledge, right? And how to write better, how to analyze better, and cite as well, right? How to highlight better citation and better referencing. So I've taken down some notes, which I want to further highlight, to give more emphasis, especially for our students. So here in our department, we have two tracks. We have the international relations track and the international development track, right? So I believe that your topic and what you've discussed will really help, especially for our fourth year students who are currently drafting their thesis. And in the first opening line that you've mentioned, right, that there is, with this pandemic, there is a struggle to do field research. And this is something that some students have already voiced out. If they feel that their research is credible, is it enough? Is it accurate? Because they can't do field research, right? So they're bound to find creative measures on how to gather first data, right? Key information, first-hand data, right? And I really like that you highlighted, the methodology, how we make sense of the world around us. I believe it's a very timely manner because this is most of the struggles, not only for students, but for also the faculty who are trying to have their own research, right? And that the interpretative work, right? Bringing who we are to our research, the concepts and the practices, how it captures, right? And you've mentioned about inequality as an example, the conditions that exist, the context and time that it depends, right? The policies that are being used. And this is why I also like to remind, especially when students write their essay, to be very specific on the way that they define specific terms. Use context-based or context-specific or an event, right, to further define what the term is all about, right? And some concepts are recycled and it's just upgraded in what policies or timeline we're talking about. And I'm really interested what you've mentioned about rethinking about maps, how it reflects on the world structure, like spaces and monuments, especially with what happened last year with the Black Lives Matter, what happened in Antwerp and in Ghent, I believe, where the protesters pulled down King Leopold II's monument or the statue, right? It was violently removed. And in Bristol as well, the protesters pulled down and even drowned the statue of Edward Colston, I believe, the slave trader, right? So they didn't want any representation anymore in their public spaces. So I believe I'd like to really highlight that. It's very important as a part of our research, part of our study, especially for international study students. And of course, the discourse and the analysis, interpreting linguistic forms, right? And highlighting the strengths and limitation for both qualitative and quantitative methods, right? So for my students, for all the students out there, I believe that you can now cite Associate Professor Lamont in your methodologies, right? And what we've learned today, I expect to see that in your essays. Specifically, we have a lot of deadlines coming this month, right? So I believe there are already questions. So maybe we can already start the Q&A. If you have a question, please raise your hand. Yes, Kerbart.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, perfectly.
Yeah, it's good to be here, and thank you, Chris, for accepting our invitation to be our speaker for this event. And your book on research method has been instrumental to our research, especially to our students. We use your book as our reference, personally on my research now and my advices as well. That's why we are excited about the release of your new edition. So with regard to the questions, I have two unrelated questions. One is on decolonial studies. So in recent years, the decolonial studies project has been growing and has been a constant discussion among IS scholars. our students are even interested in this area. So in the upcoming edition of your book, will there be a space for the colonial research method discussion? And the second question is about issues in research. There are areas in IS research where, although there are established methods, the problem lies on the ethics. Like, say, for example, the biggest dilemma in terrorism studies research is on issues on ethics, now both at the institutional and national levels. So how do we move forward about it? Because to be honest, this is the issue that I've been confronted right now. So I hope to hear your thoughts about it. Thank you.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for those questions, Kevart. They're both really good, and also kind of Agnes mentioned at the outset kind of the interest in decoloniality and post-colonial scholarship in international studies. And in the new book, yes, there is in the opening discussion a situating of methodological debates within a broader context that is often not there and hasn't really been there in the past. So for example, if you think about international relations, why do we consider the great debates to be these kind of debates that are centered around events that happened in Europe when you had a lot of interactions, you had a lot of knowledge about international, kind of the international beyond kind of particular communities that didn't even engage with the West, right? That was kind of like non-West relations. And right now our vocabulary of international studies and international relations and a lot of the examples we use, and this is something that actually that students in Tokyo, many who are from various countries, not just Japan, obviously, but kind of countries in both North and Southeast Asia, when they start their introduction to international relations class, one of the things is like, why is the textbook only like giving us examples from like European history? Because they might not have studied European history. So things like the Peace of Westphalia and the 30 Years' War, the context is not necessarily there. So there's this hegemonic narrative within not just methodology, but also within international relations more broadly that is increasingly drawn into question, but also as it relates to methodology is that there is something political within positivism, right? Although it frames itself as apolitical, that very methodological standpoint says not just a lot about what you think is important as a researcher, but also it kind of shuts off a lot of other questions and debates and perspectives. So understanding it and navigating those choices is part of how some of these debates are engaged with. And it's basically, in this sense, looking at introducing these debates in a way that's less ahistorical. Like the problem is not necessarily the historicizing, but it's just a very narrow historicizing that gets us to a particular place in the methodological debate. And what we need is, as you see kind of in kind of developments in the last couple of years, right, when you talk about, for example, slavery, or you talk about the sources of kind of the wealth of particular nations or wealth within nations, or you talk about questions like racial inequality in countries like the United States, that these aren't policy problems that lend themselves to kind of quick problem-solving fixes, but rather are deeply rooted in kind of these kind of structures that have been there for a very long time. And one of the contributions of decolonial debates, and both in terms of methodology, but also in terms of international relations, is it provides this kind of opportunity to historicize in a way that we haven't before, and also encounter certain silences within the discipline. And so that's the first. So the answer is yes. in relation to kind of updates. And the second is in relation to the question of ethics and the study of terrorism. I think this is a really good question because it's something that probably would merit its own lecture, right? The question of ethics in international studies research is that ethics is about much more, of course, than simply accessing individuals and thinking about kind of getting ethics permission for research, but it actually informs every part of our research process, right? There's from kind of coming up with your research question, I'm sure that many of you will think of or could think of things that, you know, that would be an unethical question to, or a repugnant question to propose and research. And also you have the limitation of law and systems and legality. And I think this is what Kebart, you're touching on here is that anytime you do research on illicit practices, right, there's not the same data that's available to you. And in fact, it's difficult because those actors involved, right, have a self-interest in maintaining the secrecy around what they're doing. And also governments, like archives, don't have good information about this because if they did, then it wouldn't be a problem, right, if they had all of that knowledge. And so how do you ethically research both kind of terrorist groups, but also the state in how it responds, because both of those are actors that probably aren't going to give you access to the types of information that you want. And so the short answer is that as social actors, they have to say things to legitimize what they're doing, and also they don't say things. So kind of like the discourses, but something that is the flip side of that, the silences in relation to these practices. And also I think in terms of and the broader question of ethics in relation to these groups is you might be thinking about kind of the more normative dimension of different types of groups and how do you approach them, and even how do you approach people who might be sympathetic to these groups? How do you gain their trust? What are the boundaries there in gaining trust in field work with people, right? Do you nod and just agree if they say something that you don't agree with, just to kind of improve that rapport, or do you not when talking to somebody with agency? And these are all important questions to be negotiated by the person, but also you need to keep in mind that those who you're doing research also they have their own positionality as well in relation to who you are and their own suspicions. So you're absolutely right, but I would say kind of focusing on kind of discourses and silences, right? And maybe the silences would help kind of illuminate a lot of these ethical kind of traps that are out there. So thank you so much for that, Kebart.
Thanks, Chris.
All right, we have 2 or 3 questions queued up. May I call on Christian from Pulme? A reminder for everyone to introduce yourself, what course, what year you're taking on further, and be clear with the question. Right, go ahead, Christian.
Good afternoon, Ms. Agnes and my fellow students, especially to Professor Christopher Lamont. And first of all, I'm Christian Emmanuel S. from Pulme, and I'm taking International Development and Cooperation. I'm currently in my 3rd year now. And first of all, I also like to thank Mr. Christopher Lamont for writing his book about research methodologies, and it helped us a lot last year in writing our first research project in our introduction to international studies. So, and since Mr. Kebart also opened up the topic about the growing complex issues about international studies research, my question is, in setting out unique research objective or maybe mapping out the growing IS agenda, perhaps trends. So, Mr. Limart, what do you highly suggest for students to focus more these days in writing their research topics or like subject matters?
That's a very good question, and it's one that I get a lot. That there's what topics would I suggest for students? And my answer, in a way, is I really do strongly believe that your curiosity should drive your research, and it will make your research stand out. And I see this when I read student papers, is that sometimes students feel like they need to shift their research to take into account kind of things that might be the issue of the particular day or might be methodologically popular. I think if you have a shared interest, if that is your interest, then that's fine. But it's also the case where it's really easy in writing to tell if a student's not interested, right? If you're not interested in your topic, like really genuinely, if you don't have that strong curiosity, it's really difficult in writing to communicate that type of kind of enthusiasm. And when you see that enthusiasm in the topic, then irregardless really of what your research is, and like, so for example, you might be researching a particular kind of question within development studies, and there might not be a whole lot of literature or debates on it, but then if you make it your own, you'll stand out, right? If you, I would say that kind of those topics, and I'm kind of guessing if you'd mentioned, for example, if your interests are in things like kind of historical international relations and inequality, these are big questions that are out there today. But there are a whole lot that are out there. But I would find what it is. It might be that your interest is more in kind of the environment and questions of kind of the human impact on the planet and how that is translated into politics, right, or not translated. So I just say go with what you're passionate about. Thank you, Christian.
All right, thank you, Christian. Now, can we hear from Shane, please?
Good day, Professor Lamont. I am Shane. I am an alumna of FEU International Studies. First, I would like to thank you for writing the book, Research Methods in International Studies. It is a good reference in doing our research since I've been doing it as a reference since in my undergraduate, and until now, to tell you, in my graduate studies, I am still using it as a reference in writing my research. Thank you for your substantial talk. So my question is, this is in reference to Ms. Agnes' question earlier, but in a country field research context. As mentioned in the opening remarks, doing research in the context of pandemic is really a big dilemma. The question is, how do we conduct data gathering, especially field research, when most of the countries are having a strict border control? Thank you.
Thank you so much for those kind words about the book. I'm really thrilled to hear that you're finding it helpful and useful also in your graduate studies. And you've asked a good question there. And this is something that unfortunately there isn't necessarily an easy answer to. I know a lot of academic colleagues who have essentially been locked out of countries that they've spent years researching with border closures. And this is going to be different for everyone. I understand that in a lot of cases, this is probably, a lot of instances, this is not really a solution, but for some activities like this, right, these kind of virtual presentations, getting together with researchers who are also working on your same field, but maybe digitally, to talk to them about kind of new research, what's been happening, their experiences. In a lot of cases, though, you're not, I mean, some people do say, it depending on where you're doing field work, right? It might be that you're doing field work in a place that has kind of very good kind of digital access and things like that. So you could actually transition a lot of what you were going to do in person to a format like Zoom or something like that, in terms of having kind of, especially with like elite interviews and such. And there have been some graduate researchers who never considered really using kind of a platform like Zoom to do interviews, but then they get the permission, of course, of their interview participant. And they're able to like do a Zoom interview, but then record it also, right? So it kind of, and also apparently, I guess platforms like Zoom allow, in, I guess, some variants, right, to automatically generate like the text, right, the closed captioning and things like that. So it even might do some form of transcript for you. But that's not the case for many. And I'm sure within development studies, especially, right, this is that it's kind of your sites of fieldwork are with groups of people and populations who don't have access to these things. So if you can't really interact with them face to face, then it's resulting in kind of a pause in your project. Now my answer here will also be kind of like, it kind of depends on what this project is for. Is if it's something that's on like a clock, right? Like it's a PhD project or it's a master's thesis project. And before the pandemic, you had proposed that the main kind of centerpiece data gathering would be something that would require you to travel across countries' borders. And then now you can't do that, but you still have this master's thesis to write. It might be in that case that you might want to talk with your supervisor about revisiting kind of the question and trying to deal with this in a way that you can engage with with sources that you can access remotely. That's if you're on a strict timeline. It's really tough though, but a lot of researchers are in very difficult situations as a result of the pandemic. So know that you're with a community of people who are confronting this problem. I know researchers who have gotten funding, for example, to do field work, but now they're not able to go and the funding is going to expire, right? Because the funding is only good for a particular amount of time. So there's a lot of real challenging situations that we are being confronted with, but everybody understands that this is the case, right? So nobody expects for you to do the impossible. But if you can think about kind of turning the question around, so what is it that is possible in relation to your research question and data sources, and also maybe people that you can work with. Maybe an NGO on the ground or something like that might be able to access the information that you need, or that might be helpful when you can't. Also, you can talk to researchers virtually, right? There might be, if you can't access a particular archive, there might be somebody who can, who's actually there where the archive is. So kind of drawing on the community of fellow researchers who are also faced with the same challenges is a good way to start, I think.
All right, thank you, Shane. I believe we have 2 or 3 more questions if you still have time, Professor.
Yeah, of course, sure.
All right, maybe let's begin first with Angelica and then the one on the chat. Angelica, go ahead, please. Angelica, you may go ahead with your question. Reminder to introduce yourself, your course, and your year. I have to unmute you. Okay.
Thank you, ma'am.
All right. Thank you.
Ayun. Good afternoon, Professor Lamont. I'm Angelica Cruz, fourth year International Development and Cooperation major. I just like to ask regarding qualitative research when doing, specifically when doing the method of interviews and having a transcripts. How do we go forward with coding?
Okay, so I'm assuming you've got a interview-based project where you are doing a lot of interviews and you are coding for particular terms. So you need to create categories first. So what is it that you are looking for? Right? Are you looking for negative responses, positive responses, right? As an example. And then once you have those categories, you'll come up with kind of phrases or words that would fit, that would allow you to code them into those categories. And you have a large number of interview transcripts, I would assume. So in that case, it's important. And the good thing is if you've done the interviews yourself, right? You haven't had other people do the interviews for you. You have a good sense of what's in there, a good sense of the material, and a good sense of what you are looking for already. So start with the creation of those clear categories. And then you'll go back and you'll identify those words that you can take out. And there are a lot of ways to do this. I guess the most simple way is, right, like if you have done this in like a Word document even, right, you just like Control F, find, and then you can see the numbers, the instances, like it'll show up for you. It'll tell you how many times somebody said like the word bad, for example, in your interviews.
All right. Thank you, Angelica. Can I read something from the chat? A question from one of the students. How do we avoid research biases? What are the guardrails we can have to check ourselves?
That's also it's a challenging question, but it's a good question. And it's one that recognizes from the very beginning, from the starting point, right, that as researchers or just as people, it's like human beings, right? We all have particular biases that are shaped by our life experiences, our upbringing, kind of the kind of cultural environment in which we were raised. And the question is how to avoid them. And there are different approaches to this. And one is the first step though is always to be aware of what your biases are. So think about like the question of, who am I as a researcher? Like what's your background and what might your biases be? And by going through that kind of interrogation of yourself and becoming more aware of who you are as a researcher, then you will do a lot to not necessarily kind of remove bias, because that's not something that we can do in all instances, but to be aware of what those biases are and to be able to talk about what those biases are. So the most important thing in that sense is kind of the awareness of one's own kind of positionality in relation to research. This also relates though to ethics. It kind of brings up something that sometimes this has happened where students would combine their like field work with an internship that they are doing. And so in the mind of the student, they're just still a student, right? They don't think they have like power over the people who they are interacting with. But some students doing kind of volunteer work for disaster response teams or kind of working with refugees, you might be like wearing like kind of the jacket of your organization. And then you're trying to also kind of, because you're doing this internship, maybe while doing a master's, talk to people or organize interviews, you're in contact with your supervisor. And everybody is saying yes to you, but they're saying yes to you not because you're a researcher, but because they think, oh, this is somebody who's in a position of authority over me or has kind of say in my access to things that I might need. And then you might get particular responses, right? Because of that might not necessarily reflect kind of what what somebody really thinks or believes about a particular topic. And so being aware, the more we're aware of ourselves and things that we're doing and how that comes across, and is probably the best possible guardrail for bias. Where you see bias come across kind of the most is when people are not really aware of it, of those biases.
All right, thank you for that question. Another question from the chat that I received here: how to give dignity to my interviewees or respondents, especially when interviewing indigent groups?
This is a very good question. It's a question that applies to all research that involves other people, right? That research participants. That the question of dignity, and one is having an awareness and an understanding of how the group that you're interacting with sees you, sees your community, its experience, right? Kind of with authority. There's some groups that have had a very negative experience when interacting with bureaucracies, the state, contracts, for example. And so if you show up with a stack of like papers of interview consent forms and you just say, okay, I need your signature, this can be a very intimidating, scary thing for people. And also could be something that's kind of almost implying that you don't really understand, right? What the implication of this is. And so in those cases, being aware of these communities' experiences will allow you to communicate and interact in a way that's not transactional, that you don't want to be a researcher who is doing research and just like taking knowledge away from the community for your own like personal, like kind of like this extractivist kind of model of work. But how do you as a researcher, how will your research engage with the community you're researching? How will it tell the story of the community that you're researching? How will it contribute to the story? Will there be follow-up with these people you've interacted with? And particularly with communities that don't engage with a lot of researchers or might not have been researched in this way, that follow-up can be incredibly important, but also empowering in addition to giving dignity. So kind of presenting your research, maybe making sure that your research is also published in the language of the community that you have engaged with. All of these things are things that will go way beyond your initial interaction in terms of interview, but are very important in terms of dignity. But if people feel like you've just come, they answered your questions, and then you disappear, never to be seen again, right? Then that can be seen as interpreted as kind of the falling into that same, as I think Kebart would have brought up at the beginning, and also Agnes, kind of this almost kind of colonial mindset of knowledge production, that you're kind of producing knowledge for elites and you're kind of researching these communities, not for the benefit of these communities, but for someone or something else. So thank you, a very good question.
Thank you, Associate Professor Lamont. Yes, it's kind of commodifying your research, right? So last question on behalf of the faculty and the students. What advice can you give to the younger generation of international relations scholars when it comes to research? In your case, what motivated you in your early career to continue doing IR research?
Right, so in my case, so I was an undergraduate student in the US, and I studied abroad. Well, I was looking at studying abroad. And there were several options, and one of the things one of the options that really interested me was a program in Croatia, and I'd never been there before. I started taking kind of language courses as an undergrad, but I hadn't been. But one of the things that interested me at the time was that this was a new country that had emerged from the breakup of Yugoslavia. And as a student, I was interested in kind of conflict and peace building issues. And so it just seemed a lot more interesting. And I went and kind of met and talked to students who had experienced the conflict, and it became something that I was very interested in. So I applied for, after my undergraduate degree, a Fulbright to go back and do more research, and I did. And then after that, I ended up doing my master's degree in the United Kingdom, and then being kind of lucky enough to find kind of funding to do kind of a PhD, which allowed me to continue to do research. And I'd always been interested in kind of conflict, transitional justice issues. I got a postdoc at the Transitional Justice Institute afterwards. But I have to say that the starting point for all of that was just kind of was following my interests, right? I knew that, like, well, if you thought about this kind of from a different perspective, right? If people saying, well, why would you study like a language that's only spoken by like 4 million people, right? And kind of, why are you doing research on this particular kind of question? But it was a question that I found really interesting. And that's what I was saying to students is don't feel insecure about what interests you. It's what interests you, right? It's and that embrace that, right? It could be something that, as like kind of like a quote from kind of Barbara Geddes that I had at the beginning, is it could be something that you read in scholarship and it really makes you angry because it's like, this is ridiculous. This is something that on the basis of kind of your kind of experience that just it's something that you see as like it can't be a causal explanation, for example, that actually holds water or something, or it's some other topic or question that you just might really be interested in. And that interest and curiosity, that if you don't let insecurity kind of knock you off that path that you are setting out for yourself, will shine through in your work and will be what separates your work from everybody else's work. And it will give you something that like you can write textbooks on methodologies, you can teach methods, you can teach students how to be really good at data analysis and data collection, but there's no way that you can necessarily kind of give students that spark for their topic of curiosity. And that's somewhere within you. And so you've got to find that. And then when you find that, just stick with it and be confident about it, right? Don't be insecure about what your research interests are. So I think that would be my advice.
Thank you for that advice. Maybe just a follow-up question, because most thesis groups now, or maybe second-year students, find it hard or challenged on trying to streamline their study. They want to be more specific. They have already a broad knowledge of what they want to talk about. But what kind of practices or maybe mind mapping techniques that they could do to be able to be more focused?
Go back to some of the things that brings me back to some of the things I said earlier is that initially, a lot of times, so for example, I teach a graduate level research design class for new master's students who will be writing a thesis in international relations. And a lot of them are faced with this problem, right? That they come and they can communicate a topic, but they say their first meeting with their supervisor says, well, your question is too broad, or it's not feasible, it's not answerable, go back. And they're kind of like lost after that. It's like, well, that was the question that I wanted to ask. If you break it up, like decompose it into its constituent, what are the underlying logics of what you're trying to ask and what you're trying to achieve through your research, right? So the better you understand that, and you think, okay, wait a second, no, so I'm actually interested in explaining, for example, Japan's developmental experience, right? But it's not necessarily, you're not going to create kind of a grand theory or test kind of a broad theory across a number of different countries. Or it could be a question relating to normative theory debates. But then you would identify, well, Walzer has a particular argument in relation to just war theory. Others have made these other arguments. And then you can specifically, you're starting to get more specific there, right? And that's what you need to do. And so if you try to break your project down into be able to explain what the logic is, like try to imagine yourself giving like an elevator pitch. Like just forget about your research question, for example. Just imagine that I've asked you, okay, oh, so what's your research about, right? And then in 2 minutes, you try to explain that and then use that, what you've produced, to go back and find your research question. Often you'll find your research question is kind of much better explained, right, set out that way than you have at the very beginning set out.
Thank you, Associate Professor Lamont. Yes, I'll also try to do that practice myself for my future research work, you know, how to focus, how to streamline perhaps in a very specific topic, right? So any last few advice or words, or maybe you can talk about the book to the students further before we close this?
I guess some last minute advice is that, well, first of all, thank you for attending. And I'm really pleased to have been able to interact with you. And I'm really impressed with your questions. You've asked very good questions. And also, I just want to say, I guess, just in general, is that it's a very difficult time now to study, to be a student. Just like you're talking about the difficulty in doing kind of field work and research, and that you're encountering kind of a number of challenges in thesis writing that are really unprecedented within our lifetime, certainly as researchers and academics, and to be aware of the fact that that this is not something that you uniquely have to overcome and struggle with alone, but it's something that's kind of being dealt with collectively. But also think about what opportunities potentially this opens up in getting you to think about your project a little bit more differently, maybe a little bit more deeply than you ever would have, that you might have kind of, if you think about it, come up with a kind of almost cookie cutter master's thesis, right? Had you done it like 5 years ago. But now you're being challenged to think about your project in different ways that might actually make the research that you're doing now something that is going to say a whole lot more than you ever had imagined it would say about this topic. And also, as I mentioned, your curiosity is what drives your research. And a lot of research methodology literature out there and methods literature can be a little bit dogmatic. And you might even get that as questions, right? You might get questions from kind of people like, well, why aren't you doing your research this way? Like, what is your independent or dependent variable? Is just remain confident, right? Be confident about what you're doing in relation to the methodological assumptions that you are operating in, and be open to that dialogue across kind of, sometimes that takes place across lines, but don't think that you have to do something in a way that you're not really, that doesn't relate to your own curiosity, that there are enough methodologies, there are enough topics, there are enough debates out there for you to find your home in international studies research.
All right, thank you for that. Thank you everyone for your insightful questions, and of course, Associate Professor Lamont, for the topic, the very timely topic, right? I'm sure all of the students here, and of course, my colleague can attest to that and agree to that, right? So again, thank you everyone. We'd like to present a certificate on behalf of FEU for Associate Professor Lamont. So this is for Far Eastern University from the Institute of Arts and Sciences. We'd like to award you a certificate of appreciation awarded to Associate Professor Christopher Lamont, PhD, for his valuable contribution as speaker during the webinar, Current Trends in International Studies Research, given this 30th day of September 2021 at Far Eastern University, Manila. Signed by the Department Chair, Francis M. Esteban, and Dean, Rowena Capulang Reyes, PhD. Thank you so much again, sir. And now may I call on our department chair for his closing remarks, Mr. Francis Esteban.
All right. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay. So good afternoon. Good afternoon, Chris. Thank you for accepting our invitation. And in behalf of our Dean, Dean Reyes, and our Associate Dean, Associate Dean Isla, I'd like to give our warmest gratitude to our speaker, Associate Professor Christopher Lamont, for gracing us this afternoon with his presence and valuable expertise in international studies research. A recent survey conducted by Pulse Asia shows that Philippine presidential daughter and Davao City Mayor Sara Duterte is the most preferred to be elected as president of the Philippines next year. He is followed by Bongbong Marcos, the son of the late Philippine dictator Ferdinand Marcos, and followed then by Manila Mayor Francisco Isko Moreno Domagoso. Most of the time, such presidential surveys are suited to condition the voting public. One can say that surveys such as this is a classic methodology for conducting research. We can always scrutinize this by positing questions on its validity and integrity. However, we should also not forget the power of such research. In our aim to understand and enhance our skills in developing a good research idea, we should always hold ourselves accountable of the influence it can have over its readers. We thank Professor Chris today for sharing his thoughts and for showing us how to be responsible researchers, knowledgeable of the influence our topics can have over others. In this time of fake news, truth manipulation, and propaganda, may we strive to be motivated by the objective truth and the right kind of knowledge production as we conduct our research activities. As a timeless adage would say, the pen is always mightier than the sword, but let me add something to it, that it is the person behind the pen that makes right. So once again, thank you very much for attending this webinar. We hope that everyone gained something and learned something, definitely learned something from this activity. And we look forward to have you guys here again. We look forward to have you, Chris. Hopefully, once we are able to live our lives at least in a way that we can interact each other, we welcome you to FEU, in FEU campus in Manila. It's a very beautiful campus. We hope that one day you could share your time with us there, and we'd really love to host you there. So again, good afternoon and stay safe, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It'd be my pleasure to visit.
All right. Thank you, everyone, once again. Thank you for your time. Associate Professor Christopher Lamont, again, reiterating again our gratitude for your time and your sharing your knowledge to our students and, of course, to us as well. Last two announcements before we let everyone go. Please answer the evaluation of the webinar. A link will be sent to you. And the next webinar will be held on the 9th of October. It will be a lecture with Ambassador Jose Santiago Romana. More info will be given to you via email. All right, thank you everyone for your time. If there aren't any questions or anything, you may leave the room now. Thank you.
Okay, just very quick, maybe we can ask for a very quick photo for everyone.
Yes.
So definitely, if we might request everyone to please kindly open their cameras, no, for a quick photo.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, everyone. Okay, well, if you have the virtual background, if you were able to receive the virtual background, it would be great to use it so that we will have a uniformity. Okay, so I'll be the one to capture, no? So we have 6 panels, no? We have 6 panels, so we have a total of, the last time I checked, we have 141 participants a while ago. So just keep on smiling, no? I'll take a screenshot, okay? Okay, smile. All right, so next panel. Okay. Right. Okay, so and that's it. Okay, so once again, thank you everyone. Please do not forget to answer. Please do not forget to answer the evaluation form, which is now in the chat box. So have a good afternoon. Thank you.